much ago, I would like to now welcome our final speaker, Ms. Julie Kaylor, who will be presenting on gene editing, playing God, or communing with God. Go ahead, Julie.
Thank you all so much. This is a lovely, my fellow speakers have set up, this talk perfectly, because as they're talking about transhumanism, we're now on the brink of improving human beings optimally. So this talk is going to review the application of gene editing, the history and concepts behind it, and how we might think about that in the Christian faith. So before everyone, clutches their pearls or wrings their hands, I just wanted to refresh that manipulating the genetic makeup of the population or an individual is not at all a new concept to humanity. And this is something that we have done for a long time. So many, I've even seen on evangelical blogs, this verse from Leviticus being used to justify avoiding or not consuming genetically modified crops, or being anti-GMO, which I think is an interesting take. And of course, the next sentence in this verse from the Old Testament is, do not wear clothing of two different fibers. So I think if we're wearing some polyester today, we're already heathens. So just to start with a little levity, but now to review that the main mechanism of controlling the genetics of populations in the past has been controlled or selective breeding. We see this in the Old Testament with the speckled or solid sheep, which were separated and interbred to keep those as distinct populations. Anyone who has a Labradoodle today knows that we are really active in selective breeding of certain types of animals to produce a desired result, maximizing certain genes and minimizing others. And then historically, royalty has used inbreeding as a way to consolidate power, but also to propagate preferential genes. And now we have mechanisms at our disposal beyond just selective breeding. So with modern technology, historically, and a lot of know-how and maybe some money, you could insert a bioluminescent gene from a jellyfish into a little kitty cat and have a glow-in-the-dark kitty cat. GMO crops have really revolutionized agriculture because we are able to, insert genes that make certain crops more resistant to pests, and thus we're able to use less pesticides, which is better for the environment. But as we all know, there's a lot of controversy around GMOs as well. And in the prenatal or reproductive setting, we have many technologies and applications at our disposal to select or control the genetic makeup of our offspring. And I'm going to dive a little deeper into that, just to set the landscape of where we are today with this kind of technology. So when someone is considering reproducing, they have many options at their disposal. One is sex selection, so sorting sperm or selecting embryos based on the presence of X or Y chromosomes. This is currently available for use in the United States, but only for limited purposes, such as family balancing. If you've had 3 boys and you just really want that girl, that would be an appropriate scenario for this technology. Or if there's an X-linked disorder, you could use this technology for that purpose as well. And then for couples going through IVF, there's an option to do mutation genetic diagnosis. So after fertilization, as the embryo has grown a few cells, a couple of those cells are extracted and tested so that ideally only the healthy embryo would be implanted. So avoiding a known family disorder or something like that. And then every pregnant person has the opportunity and may choose to do screening for chromosomal disorders. Hormone tests, which were pretty inaccurate, have been largely replaced by routine prenatal genetic testing, which is highly accurate and can identify chromosomal abnormalities, such as Down syndrome, or more serious fatal abnormalities like trisomy 13 or 18. And the outcomes of this may be twofold. So some families identifying a child at risk may choose to deliver at a high complexity care center, improving the likelihood of good outcomes. Or a family may choose to terminate the pregnancy in face of a diagnosis. And this is very culturally dependent. For instance, data from 2012 in Great Britain demonstrates that 90% of couples who received a diagnosis of Down syndrome subsequently terminated the pregnancy, whereas in the United States, that rate is only 67%. And if we just think about prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome as an example case, there are many ethical concerns about identifying and potentially modifying the population and how culture impacts that. And whose decision is it to make? And can everyone access the tests or the services that might impact the genetic makeup of a population? So we're thinking about all those elements and also about the stakeholders. And we'll discuss this in detail when we get into gene editing technologies. And so as we evaluate our role in kind of shaping or understanding the future of gene editing and how it intersects with faith, I feel like it is very helpful to take a step back and think of how Christianity has interacted and has a history of guiding population genetic change. So the Crusades long ago were religious persecutions, and they targeted variety of folks, including the European Jewish population. And it was so effective in that genocide that it brought down the European Jewish population to about 350 individuals who then were isolated and inbred. And when I say inbreeding, it just means within a population. And so this bottleneck actually led to a higher than average proportion of certain diseases within the Jewish population, such as breast and ovarian cancer, Tay-Sachs disease. So you can see how this religious act many years ago has real implications on our modern genetic makeup. Additionally, many Christian populations really adhere to the biblical concept of not being unequally yoked. And this is understandable to keep within your culture and set of beliefs, but inbreeding within populations reduces the gene pool and can lead to an abundance of autosomal recessive diseases. So this happens in certain Christian populations, such as the Amish population. And we can't ignore that Christianity has roots, and some of the modern evangelical concepts have roots in eugenics. So eugenics was a movement in the early 1900s to try and encourage reproduction of favorable folks and discourage reproduction of those they didn't find favorable. And so this was common in sermons. They talked about the hereditary sin and showing two different families, the Edwards and the Jukes. And then in the 1930s, an atheist named Paul Popenoe founded the American Institute of Family Relations. And this institute was an advocate for segregation and forced sterilization of those who were deemed a waste of humanity. This institute inspired Hitler's Third Reich and many of their practices. And interestingly, this institute trained many clergy on principles to reduce obstacles that would impact or hinder white heterosexual mating. This is important in the modern evangelical movement because someone we all probably have heard of, James Dodson, was actually the assistant of Paul Popenoe, and Popenoe wrote the foreword to his book. And many of those concepts are really common in our Christian concepts today. And so why is this an issue now, and why are we really focused on gene editing and how that might shape the genetics of our future populations? Well, it's because it's more broad and accessible now. The CRISPR-Cas9 RNA and protein system is a recent discovery, and it acts as scissors to cut precise areas of DNA so that specific genetic changes can be altered. What is revolutionary about this is that it is cheap, it is easy, and it's fast. And that was not true of many other genetic editing technologies. It's so easy, you can do it without a lot of scientific training, leading to a growing population of biohackers who actually are doing this in their garages. So how is gene editing being applied today? The least controversial application would be for therapeutic purposes to cure disease. Now, we of course have to define disease, and that applied in only certain body parts. Curing genetic forms of blindness by applying the technology within the eye. Curing spinal muscular atrophy or sickle cell disease by adjusting genes in blood cells or motor neuron cells. A little bit less accepted and scientifically controversial is the idea of treating a disease in an entire person with gene editing. So this has been done a few times, and each time has been largely condemned by the scientific community because the application of gene editing for an entire organism and future generations is ethically fraught, and we also don't understand the whole body reaction to this technology. Enhancement, or improving upon normal, which of course is going to be a subjective term, in the body is another application. This could be, editing blood cells to carry oxygen better to improve athletic performance. It could, reduce inflammation and improve healing and recovery. And then finally, the most controversial, least widespread application, and probably most upon whole individuals and their future, and I see my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully you guys can still hear me, and future generations. So this is not only designer babies, but this is super soldiers. And that's going to be a broad complex of ethical concepts that we must consider. How can we reduce harm while not alienating folks in the population? How can we honor the creations of God, but not change those creations beyond what God created? Who is entitled to make these decisions? And how can we ensure equal access to these technologies or benefits? And of course, we have to think about the stakeholders involved. Not only the individual, but the family and caregivers have a right to reduce suffering. Society as a whole may benefit from gradual improvement or gradual reduction of diseases that cause suffering. However, what do we lose in society by losing our ability or our diversity there? And then the state of science itself. As we learn more, we are compelled to push forward, but perhaps that can be tempered as well. And in conclusion, I just wanted to point out, we don't know enough about how the body and brain work to know if we change one thing, what else does it change? If we cured dyslexia in Einstein, would he have thought the same? If we, treat achondroplasia, a common form of dwarfism, we wouldn't have Peter Dinklage in Game of Thrones, and that would be a tragedy for us all. So we just don't know, and what we think might be reducing suffering might actually be limiting humanity's potential and creative outlet and opportunities. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And we just have 3 more minutes for questions.
Yeah, so I had a question about transhumanism and how to talk about this. There's kind of like a negative response we can give. I'm wondering to what extent there's like a constructive response possible, or if that's really not a good idea. What I would say, let me just give you a couple of sentences, and I'd like to hear the speaker's response to it to tell me if I'm really off base or not. It does seem that one of the teachings of Scripture is that we're not really in our final form. We're still going to have bodies and all that in the future, but where we are now isn't the final form of what a human is. There'll be something glorified and different about us in the future. And in that sense, although we are kind of bound to our moment now, and then this is what it means to be human, this isn't the full extent of it. And isn't transhumanism just echoing that, and in some ways making more plausible a lot of historical Christian doctrines, and making it more believable that those things are even possible? Now, I don't know if humans can get there on our own, but it makes it possible. I mean, it makes it at least seem logically possible, like that God could actually do that with us.
That's a lovely thought. What element would you like a response to? What was the question?
Well, I think that's a constructive response rather than the idea of saying it's like kind of like a. I'm wondering if it's possible to take that type of positive response versus the more negative approach that I sometimes see, not necessarily from the speakers here, of saying that it's rooted in things that aren't Christian, and or it's like a substitute for the Christian view of these things. I wonder if it might be better to understand it as an incomplete theology instead of a wrong theology. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I would love my fellow speakers to loop in on that in the chat. That would be great. David or Perry?
Sure, I'll try to make this quick. I appreciated your talk. You made me think of something that I'm going to get the wording wrong, but C.S. Lewis said somewhere that what we call mastery over nature is often one group of people with power over another group of people, and with nature as the instrument, and specifically people of the present having power over people of the future. And I wonder if you could comment on that, not just the concern of making a mistake, which impacts future people, but whether there's, even if we didn't make mistakes with unintended consequences, is there an issue of unethical or inappropriate exertion of power by us over the people of the future?
I think it is perhaps the most poignant point we could make today. And that's, we have these technologies at our disposal, and many of them are being applied in ethical ways, but there is unequal access to those technologies. So a family in the United States of means has the option of having a child without a horrific family disorder. And a child elsewhere in the world does not have that option. And as we progress and as this technology is more mainstream and we have growing expectations of perfection in that way, or at least the absence of significant disability, a child whose parents decide to go natural and is born with a disability, will they have a wrongful birth lawsuit on their hands? A county provider who's not super aware of PGD via IVF, can that couple then sue that doctor for wrongful birth? I think there's a lot of future implications to access to these technologies and who is applying them and who can even offer them or knows about them. Thanks so much, David. That was a great question.
This is a very interesting topic. I know we have got a lot of questions, and I hope you all enjoyed this session. We have more on transhumanism coming up in the plenary session today at 4 p.m. So make sure you check into that and enjoy the rest of your day. God bless everyone.